Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Emma Wee, as it says on the slide. I'm an associate coach and have been for the last 8 years at Genius Within. We specialise in supporting neurodiverse people in work with strategy coaching, diagnostics, and kind of a whole picture support in terms of helping people reach their full potential and ensuring that they're not seen just as a label, they're seen as a person and being able to kind of fulfill their potential in the workplace. Today, we're going to be talking about autism. In particular, we're going to be talking about kind of what it is as opposed to what it might be perceived to be. Autism's had kind of a revelation, if you like, over the last sort of 4 to 5 years. And sort of we're working hard to kind of dispel the ideas that have been traditionally seen in terms of the way that autism has kind of usually been kind of perceived in terms of what people are capable of doing and how they behave. Siena is going to be joining me halfway through in terms we're going to be doing kind of an interview, kind of Q&A between ourselves, and then we're going to be going to sort of open the panel up to everyone else as well. So neurodiversity is effectively differently wired brains. We have different ways of processing the world, and if you're specifically neurodiverse, you may slot into kind of one of these 4 different areas. So we look at it as an umbrella term. Neurodiversity in terms of applied neurodiversity, looking at things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia, they tend to be things that are diagnosed around about the age of 7 or 8, which is when the kind of the motor and the speech functions tend to wire up in a child. Clinical neurodiversity, looking at things like autism, ADHD, Tourette's, things like that, they have to be diagnosed through a medical pathway, whereas applied neurodiversity tends to go through an educational psychologist. Those tend to have more social markers or behavioural markers, and that means that they can be diagnosed at an earlier age from about 18 months onwards. Then we have acquired neurodiversity, and this is where the brain has something that alters the kind of pathways or wiring later on in life. That can be things like chronic fatigue syndrome, we have long COVID, things like MS, fibromyalgia, Ehlers-Danlos, and also things like depression and anxiety. So these are things that kind of impact the way that the brain processes and kind of functions on a day-to-day level. That can shift and it can change, or it could be something that kind of is there as a kind of a permanent profile. The thing to kind of acknowledge is that things that are transient neurodiversities can have more of an impact on processing than an underlying condition. So if there's a combination of the two, say for instance, if you've got anxiety and depression, you may see things to do with a neurodiverse condition such as autism or dyslexia, that the impact of those may have a greater kind of impact when it's combined with something like depression and anxiety, or kind of a kind of muscular or chronic fatigue syndrome. The comorbidity of conditions is also quite important to take into account. So there's quite a high comorbidity or combination of, say, ADHD and autism, and also dyspraxia and autism. So both of those impact attention, and also to do with muscle control, particularly to do with the dyspraxia side of things. Okay, so autistic spectrum conditions. So there's been a kind of a revamping of the terminology to do with ASC recently, which is slightly ironic because as autistic people, we like to have absolutes, and to have our labels mucked around with doesn't necessarily help us anyway. It's not something that you catch, it's not something that you develop, you're born with it. So it's definitely a kind of familial, kind of genetic sort of pathway. The chances are, if you're autistic, there's going to be a thread somewhere in your family background. Quite often when people are diagnosed later on in life, they tend to be diagnosed because their children's diagnosis is being picked up at the same time. Quite often we gravitate towards things that match our strengths. So it means that things may not become apparent until later on in life, when sort of things may change in work, or we don't have strategies to kind of support the things that are kind of challenging for us. So it's not unusual for people to be diagnosed later on in life. When I started working with young people with autism about 25 years ago, it was commonly thought that there weren't any high functioning women with autism, and that's very quickly changed sort of over the last sort of 4 to 5 years. And so we present differently, women and men present differently, particularly to do with what was traditionally known as Asperger's syndrome. Much more women are being acknowledged as having sort of Asperger's or kind of high functioning autism than there was previously thought. Um, we just tend to have different strategies and different presentations in terms of masking and how it kind of presents for us internally in terms of what I call internal noise or kind of social processing. It's very interesting the way that diagnosis has changed over the last few years. Um, Again, traditionally, because women weren't seen to be sort of high functioning, the diagnoses were typically kind of seen as more mental health conditions. So women were typically more diagnosed with bipolar, kind of chronic sort of manic depression. And of course, not having a diagnosis and not understanding and feeling as though you're other can create quite a significant amount of mental health, poor mental health conditions. But actually having a diagnosis or having a context for why you process the world that you do can often ease quite a lot of those, the impact of those kind of feelings. I had a client earlier this week who just understanding that what she's experiencing is more to do with sensory overload rather than social anxiety has lessened the impact of her sort of past trauma and past stress significantly, even just within a couple of weeks. So it can, having a diagnosis can be hugely beneficial for people to understand why they are and why they react the way that they do. Okay, so we talk about a spectrum of autism, and people kind of do tend to think that you're either kind of non-verbal or verbal. It's not really like that. We have lots of different kind of areas where we might have tremendous strengths and things that might drop off the processing because of internal or external distractors. For me, my biggest distractor is sound. If I have kind of someone talking with a very loud voice next to me, I would really struggle to be talking to you right now because my processing speed would kind of drop off kind of like a cliff, and then I would have to kind of try and sort myself out again. So it's understanding that there's a kind of almost like a seesaw effect with processing. We can process things at a very high level and understand things kind of at quite a complex kind of sort of level as well, but there may be things that in terms of executive function we might find really simple things quite difficult to kind of comprehend or kind of sort out, which can be very frustrating, you know, sort of being hugely intelligent but then really struggling to kind of organize yourself to get out the front door sometimes can be the seesaw effect of kind of what's going on. So the perceived ideas or kind of misconceptions about being autistic. People have a misconception about autism in the sense that we don't have empathy, or we don't kind of understand sort of what people are feeling. We may not be able to accurately name what other people are feeling, but that doesn't mean to say we're not experiencing it. And sort of from the usual feedback that I get from and sort of my own experience as well, it's usually that we're feeling too much, we're kind of absorbing, and we're much more raw to what's going on around us because we have no filters to the sensory information that's going on around. There's something called alexithymia, which is where you can't name the emotion that you're feeling, and sometimes it's not understanding what someone might be putting out in terms of the non-verbal information that may mean that some misunderstandings may occur. We all have strengths. They may not all be the kind of idea that people have about the savants, that not everybody is a complete genius in one area, but it will be true that we'll be really interested and involved in something that we find fascinating, and that we will kind of probably try and absorb as much as we can about something if we're really interested in. Like I said earlier, it's really typical nowadays for people to be diagnosed much later on in life, and it can be something that can be really helpful to put your life experience, and particularly in relation to other people, into context. Okay, so the challenges that are typified by ASC are there's kind of 4 or 5 different areas. So social communication, when you're communicating with people, there's a lot of subtext. If people are not particularly clear about what they're saying, if you're trying to read between the lines, that might be tricky sometimes. Quite often something might be said, or I might say something, and then I might ponder over that a lot and kind of worry quite a lot about that. So that's kind of what I call the internal noise about communication. Sometimes that can be quite confusing. Um, there is something called masking, which quite a lot of people do, which is where you hold down the internal anxiety and worry and present what is seen to be a kind of a normal face, if you like, or a neurotypical face. But that takes a huge amount of social processing, of social energy. So it means that being in a social situation might be actually quite exhausting for someone who's on the spectrum. Social imagination. So there is something called mirror neurons that are not switched on in the autistic brain, and this forms like a feedback loop. So typically it might present itself as someone's got bad breath. The autistic person will go, "You've got bad breath." The neurotypical brain might go, "I won't say that because it might cause some offense to the other person." But the mirror neurons don't switch on. So it just comes out, "That's a fact, I'm going to say it." Which can obviously cause some issues from time to time if you say the first thing that comes into your mind may not be the thing that you necessarily need to say out loud. Social interaction, sort of having a lot of sensory information that you're kind of absorbing in the moment, means that when you're meeting someone for the first time, you're not just trying to formulate an acceptable pattern of communication, you're also dealing with all of the sensory information. So sometimes people will imagine that someone's being antisocial by not keeping eye contact. The chances are that if they're looking off to the side, they're probably trying to focus on what you're saying rather than what they're looking at, because that can be very distracting. I'll give you a very good example of someone who was interviewing a number of individuals for ITV, and they put them in a room facing a very lovely scene of the Thames. But what it meant was that 9 out of 10 of the interviewees couldn't focus on what they wanted to say because they were so visually distracted by what was going on outside. So kind of having sort of to process that information in the moment can be quite sort of difficult for people occasionally. Flexibility of thought. If you imagine that all your senses are on max the whole time, and the brain is literally like a mind map, we can see all the what ifs very, very quickly. And that takes up quite a large amount of space and processing. So time becomes kind of quite um, sort of either kind of stretched out or kind of compressed, depending on how much we're trying to process in the moment. And if you imagine that you're trying to move from moment to moment with all of that sensory information going on, you'll probably want to try and limit the amount of information that you're trying to process in any given moment. And that will mean that you'll probably want to have things that are structured, predictable, understanding what the next point forward will be. So language around time, for instance, can be quite tricky for people who are on the spectrum, particularly say things like, "I'll get back to you soon." Okay, but when soon? And what do I do with that soon? "I'll get back to you in a minute." Okay, it's been a minute, and now what do we do? And it's not about being inflexible, it's just about managing the amount of information in that moment to make sure that we can safely move through the next point in time. Okay, sensory processing. So this is a big thing for people on the spectrum in terms of how much we process in terms of smells, colors, textures, tastes, noise, all of that stuff can very swiftly kind of sort of absorb and saturate our systems. So knowing how to decompress, knowing how to desaturate is a really fundamental way of being able to manage our processing. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about processing within the brain to kind of put some of that into context in terms of sensory and kind of the challenges that we have. So processing speed is a little bit like the rev counter on your car. It's a bit like the cognitive power that you have to do an available task in that moment. So if you think about your car not being in gear, you put your foot down on the accelerator, that needle fluctuates up and down. And that's basically how much capacity we have in any given moment. When you're neurodiverse, you have a baseline of that processing given over to your condition. So the things that you are typically having to process more, like the sensory information or the interaction, that takes up an initial part of that processing. If you're tired or you're stressed or anxious, you're already at a slight deficit. So those things are going to impact your processing speed even further. For instance, depression literally depresses cognitive ability. It's a bit like stepping on a hose pipe. You step back on it, nothing flows. You back off, everything flows. So the things that you're going to find more challenging, like social interaction or communication when you're tired, are going to be the things that you're going to find hardest when your processing speed drops. So if you want to communicate well, if you want to communicate successfully, you need to make sure you've got enough processing speed and also social energy available to do the things that you find the most tricky. I'm going to talk about memory a little bit, because sometimes people make comments about people who are autistic as, why can't you get over that? And why is that still bugging you? Memory is formed a bit like a rope. So the more sensory information that is absorbed in a particular moment in time, the stronger that rope is, the more strands there is to that memory. And that gets processed and then chucked back into long-term memory. So every time that some information or sensory information that is in a given moment, the brain checks in its library of memories to see what that kind of relates to and whether the system is safe or it needs to kind of react. So if you think about an autistic brain absorbing lots of sensory information all the time, typically our memories, particularly if they're linked to emotional memories, tend to be quite strong. So if something has upset us, then when we rethink about that moment, and I think the best description I heard of it once was like a slideshow that's gone out of whack. When that slide comes back into play, we re-experience all those emotions as strongly as when we first experienced them. So when you're talking about helping someone deal with that, quite often you have to give a different perception of that memory. You're in this moment now, it's not back then. But that's why sometimes it can be quite difficult for people who are autistic to not feel as intensely about something that might have happened 4, 5, 6 years ago. People quite often say, why are you overreacting? Or they seem to overreact. And it's not that people are overreacting, it's that the level to which we're experiencing something is much more intense than someone who's neurotypical. And so that means that we will typically kind of have a stronger reaction. And when I'm working with managers in particular, I quite often say, pay attention to the trigger, not the noise. The noise, if someone's stressed and anxious, their communication skills are probably going to be less effective. So they'll probably say and do things that are not seen to be socially as acceptable in the workplace. But if you're paying more attention to the trigger, what might have instigated that reaction, then you'll probably deal with it a lot more successfully than simply reacting to what's being said in front of you. Sensory saturation is kind of linked to sort of quite often linked to kind of emotional kind of meltdowns. So this is why I was saying it's very important to be able to kind of decompress and de-stim. The more space that you have available in your brain, the more space you have to be able to process new stuff and be able to kind of stay more in control and be able to self-regulate your emotions. Whereas if you're consistently in a situation where you're overstimulated or you're absorbing too much information, sensory information or emotional information, the chances are that box won't be able to kind of sustain that. And in an autistic system, that can get filled up very, very quickly. Quite often for an individual to know that they've got a way of being able to desaturate, a space to decompress, ways to manage their own kind of sensory overload, that can make all the difference than feeling as though they kind of can't do something or can't go somewhere to kind of decompress. But it's really about understanding where they are on that saturation point. Okay, so how do we support people successfully? Looking at sort of obviously kind of medical support in terms of making sure that if there is any kind of sort of additional medication or kind of sort of difficulties around the physical state, making sure that there's a good circle of care in terms of mental health support. strategies, obviously with coaching, sort of a lot is placed around self-awareness of patterns, and then being able to adapt and put strategies in place to support the self. Having, like I said, having an understanding and a context for how patterns kind of behave, and how we behave in terms of day-to-day actions can be hugely helpful in an individual supporting themselves rather than having to be rescued by everyone around them. And then again, looking at ways to be able to understand when you need to support the kind of sensory saturation, so that the thing that is the most challenging, the communication side of stuff, can be supported and successfully done. Okay, so within the workplace, what are the things that you can do to support someone? One of the things that I quite often work with people is where they feel that they can't say how they feel to someone who's autistic. And I think if the thing that tends to kind of confuse people who are autistic more is when people faff around a subject. Much prefer someone being direct, and being, as long as it's fact driven and there's a context for, say, for instance, if something needs to be changed, what is the context, what is the reason and justification for that change? Because the reaction from someone who's autistic, or adverse reaction, will tend to be if they don't understand why something is happening. So long as you're giving a staggered approach, enough information, and information within the context of a bigger picture, that person will more likely to be able to react and adapt for themselves in a way that's actually safe and comfortable for everyone. So being able to be really clear, really specific. We use something called clean feedback quite a lot at Genius Within, which is a fact-driven form of feedback, something that's predictable, something that's already mediated, and it allows an individual both to be heard and to hear what's being said to them clearly. Allowing someone the flexibility to decompress between meetings, making sure that they've got enough information to calibrate their own knowledge. Autistic people like to be seen but not looked at, sort of, placement within kind of an office environment. Things like onboarding within interviews, making sure that you can send out pictures or LinkedIn profiles of people who are going to be interviewing the individual. That will mean that they're not having to process those faces first thing when they kind of come into the interview. Simple things like, here's a photograph of where you're going to be interviewed, here's the kind of like photo journey of coming up to the building. Things like that can be massively beneficial for an individual, and they work for everyone. And quite often reasonable adjustments are not unreasonable requests, and therefore things that will work for the neurodiverse person will generally work for everyone else around them as well. Okay. So in the past, there was quite often a level of exclusion when it came to kind of neurodiversity. When I started coaching, reasonable adjustments and the coaching process were seen as an active way of kind of managing someone out of the workplace. Now I'm happy to say it's much more about investing in the individual and ensuring that they can find their own way of working. And quite often a working preference is not necessary, or working style is not necessarily a working preference. And often when people find their working preference and know how to support themselves working at their best, they don't need as much support, or sort of organisations don't feel that they need to kind of micromanage an individual quite so much. Obviously, over the time, people have seen that kind of reasonable adjustments, and the 2010 Disability Act meant that everybody should have some awareness training around dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD and autism, in terms of kind of, obviously, you don't necessarily have to force people to be able to include sort of neurodiverse, but where you're actively looking for the strengths that neurodiversity can bring to a team, then you're starting to produce an environment where inclusion becomes part of the fabric of an organisation, where it shouldn't actually be something that's different, and it's just something that's part of the makeup that is inclusive and allows plenty of people to be able to thrive without feeling as though they're standing out. Okay, so that's my bit. I'm now going to talk to Siena, Siena, obviously, as you can see, she's been a kind of a great ambassador and um, able to promote and also show the strengths of what it's like to be autistic, neurodiverse, and successful in the world. So I'm going to ask Siena a few questions, and Siena's going to answer them. Okay. So tell me, Siena, what work do you do within the neurodiverse community?
Yeah, so I'm a neurodiversity advocate. I've been in the neurodiversity sphere for 5 years now. I started out when I was 13 with my first website, QL Mentoring, which is a website to support and mentor children with learning differences and autism. Then in 2018, I launched Neurodiversity Celebration Week. That was a week to empower neurodiverse students and flip the narrative to focusing on the positives of neurodiversity instead of focusing on the negatives. I think that especially in the school system, it's always focused on our perceived deficits instead of on our strengths, and that can create a lot of self-esteem problems within the neurodiverse community.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was 16, I wrote my book, The Spectrum Girls Survival Guide, a workbook for autistic girls. And since then, a lot of my work has been around talking about autism in women. That's something that's not talked about enough. A lot of people think, oh, you know, autism is a predominantly male condition. And a lot more men are diagnosed than women, but I don't think that's because there are more autistic men than women. I think it's because the diagnosis criteria is biased towards men.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really true. And like I said, sort of typically in the past, women will have been diagnosed with much more mental health conditions, and the autism side of stuff would have been missed completely. But when you readdress individuals through an autistic diagnostic lens, then more parts fit, and then that makes more sense for the individual as well. What can you say about your experience of neurodiversity?
Yeah, so I am autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, and I also have ADHD. I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was 8, dyspraxia when I was 10, and then autism when I was 12. And I'm incredibly grateful that I got diagnosed when I was, because for a lot of women, you know, they get diagnosed in their 40s, they get diagnosed when their children are diagnosed. At school, I had a very challenging time. A lot of teachers didn't understand me and would come up with their own narratives to explain why I was different. It was just things like they thought that I couldn't be dyslexic because I could read. And so they told me that I was lazy, and that was why I had bad spelling. I had to go to 11 different schools because I was ruthlessly bullied by both students and teachers. But it made me stronger, and it made me fight more for my activism, because there are so many people within the neurodiverse community who went through what I went through, going to so many schools, being pushed out of mainstream education. When I was going through it, I felt like I was the only one, but it's not a unique experience to a lot of people in the community. And so it's important to start talking about that and to start breaking down those miscommunications and those barriers and fighting for acceptance of neurodiverse individuals.
That's very true. I think it's also particularly with the kind of mental health crises going on with young people in particular, and how much of our young people, you know, sort of not having a diagnosis can be really challenging for an individual to, like I said, not understand why they're different and why they're not responding or reacting to things like everyone else. And having an early diagnosis can be massively important in being able to build the confidence and resilience for a young person so that they don't have much more prolonged mental health, poor mental health conditions later on in life. That's really key. Um, what ways do you think that autistic girls present differently to boys?
In many ways, I'll talk about my own experience. Autistic girls present differently because they're socialized differently. You know, we live in a very sexist society where women are expected to smile and have, you know, for me, when I was at school, I didn't smile. I didn't have friends, especially when I was very young. I had this obsession with dinosaurs, and that was my special interest. And I had a sensory processing disorder that meant that I only wore one outfit. Because anything else, it would cause me anxiety. It was just this one cotton outfit that was soft enough that it wouldn't give me a panic attack. And I was very happy that way. But then as I got older, people started making comments about it and shaming me for it. And a lot of it was sexism related. I remember vividly, I was 7 years old. I was in the playground waiting for my mom to pick me up. And the father of one of my classmates came up to me and said, "Why aren't you smiling?" And I went home and I remember I said to my mom, like, "Why did he say that to me? Why should I have been smiling? I was just standing by myself. I was just kind of thinking about my day." And she said, "Well, he probably thought that little girls should smile. He probably expected that from you." And so I remember that night, I looked in front of my mirror and I practiced smiling, and I told myself that I didn't want anyone to say that to me again. And so I was going to start doing that now. And that was kind of the first time that I started masking. And then I went to a new school after that, and I had a teacher who told me, "This obsession that you have with dinosaurs is weird." She gave me 3 tokens, and she told me, "Every time you talk about dinosaurs, I'm going to take away a token. And if at the end of the day you don't have any tokens, then you get a house point deducted," which was a big deal for primary school me. And so I stopped talking about dinosaurs. My mom still has encyclopedic knowledge about it because she had to listen to me go on about it all the time. But I don't remember anything about dinosaurs because that teacher kind of shamed me out of it. And then the clothing, I got bullied about that for years. People didn't understand why I only wore one outfit. There was all this pressure of like, "You're a girl, you should have these nice dresses, you should be interested in fashion," and I wasn't. But I got so much pressure that I ended up wearing things that would make me uncomfortable. I remember one time on school mufti day, I was crying in the car because the outfit I was wearing was so uncomfortable. It was giving me like a panic attack. But I was like, this is what I've got to do to not be bullied for this. And so very quickly I learned to mask in that way. And then that meant that for a lot of people, I looked like I was neurotypical. I was presenting in that way. And then when I was 12 years old and the anxiety of all of that caught up to me and I ended up with mental health problems, and the stars really had to align for me to get a diagnosis. But when I sat there, it was a difficult conversation because they didn't think I was autistic for a little bit. It was a real conversation as to where I was because I was making eye contact, I was smiling, I had intonations in my voice, and that was all because of years of masking. And so yeah, girls definitely present differently than boys, and there needs to be more talking about that, and we need to change the diagnosis criteria so that women start getting diagnosed.
I think that's very true. And sort of I haven't gone for formal diagnosis, but it wasn't until I was 40 and started meeting other women who were formally diagnosed and realized that I presented in exactly the same way as they did, that the penny dropped. And for me, a kind of a lifetime of kind of, like I sort of said, the mental kind of internal noise and sort of mental health ups and downs probably would have been kind of much more assuaged if I'd understood why I was processing or feeling the way that I was. And it just, nearly 50 now. So things have kind of, it's taken a long time for kind of those things to be able to kind of click and fall into place and know how to support myself now so that I don't have the same kind of like sort of mental pain that I did when I was kind of growing up. So definitely it sort of needs to shift, it needs to change. How do you think we can now best support neurodiverse students in education now? I mean, obviously there's a much greater awareness. I mean, although there may be kind of lots of programs to support sort of individuals, but quite often it's still at a societal level. Teachers don't necessarily have as much awareness. But so, how can we kind of further that? How can we kind of improve things for neurodiverse children within school now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there needs to be a conversation on reasonable adjustments. Students need to be, teachers need to be educated in neurodiversity, but there also needs to be an element of each neurodiverse person is their own individual with their own story and their own presentation. So for me, I'm dyslexic, but I can read fine. I have other problems with my spelling, and so certain adjustments that would help one dyslexic person wouldn't help me. And so focusing on the individual, and also just creating that inclusive environment where people feel comfortable to come and ask for adjustments. My story, being a comorbid person, is each of my differences required maybe 3 or 4 reasonable adjustments. Like for my autism, I needed a few sensory adjustments. For my ADHD, I needed a few adjustments where I can't be near things that can distract me, like a window. For my dyslexia, I need some extra time. For my dyspraxia, I need a few accommodations in sport. And when you would total all of them up, it would be like 15, 20 adjustments, small things. But I always felt like I can't ask for that. And so I would limit myself to 2 or 3 because I would think they're gonna judge me, they're gonna make me out to be difficult. And sometimes I'd ask for 4 and they'd say, you don't belong in mainstream education, you're just too challenging. And so definitely creating that environment where people feel comfortable to come to you, to talk about all the adjustments they need, to talk about all the ways that you can help them and support them is beneficial, because just because one student's coming up to you and asking you for one small adjustment doesn't mean that they feel comfortable in the space. They may have other things that they're not sharing with you that you could help them with.
I think that's equally true for both the kind of staff, but also for children as well. If you've got a culture where differences are talked about, or children have an understanding of what's going on for them, then they're much more likely to be able to manage themselves differently as well. My son had a stroke, but he also has ADHD and my sound sensory stuff with the ASC as well. And his sound is physically painful for him. But we have conversations where we talk about his conveyor belt, his kind of sensory, auditory processing. His conveyor belt is too small and things fall off the conveyor belt. So that makes it difficult for him to answer in class. But then he's able to then talk to his teachers about that. And he's only 8, but we've talked about that from a really early age. So if parents have that awareness as well, if they notice things, then they can also be part of that conversation as well, I think, to allow the children to support themselves, the way that they then don't feel as though they're asking for something that's unusual. They're just asking for what works best for them.
Mm.
Yeah. In terms of being in work, how do you think that we can improve kind of support for neurodiverse individuals within the workplace?
My kind of ideas on this have changed. Right now, I feel like we need to adapt a person-centric model. We can't have this idea of if you are neurodiverse and if you have a diagnosis, then you can get adjustments. But if you think you're neurotypical, then you're just treated like everyone else and there are no adjustments. I mean, especially through my work with autistic women and looking at all of that, there's so many people who aren't diagnosed. And I think that we should create a system where if you have an autistic woman who doesn't think she's autistic, thinks that she's neurotypical, but knows that she has a sensory processing disorder, maybe even doesn't know the term for it, but knows that there's something along those lines, that she can go to her boss and say, hey, I don't want to sit under these fluorescent lightings because it makes me uncomfortable. Have that person-centric model where everyone is asked about the small adjustments they need that could make their lives easier. And the workforce thinks, oh, that's going to be a lot of effort. But you'll really see the results. You know, if you put me in a situation where I'm allowed to use my spell check and I'm in a quiet space, I will be so much more productive than if you put me in the middle of a busy room and I have 5 panic attacks that I have to work through that day. That is not an environment where I get my best work done. And so I think that we really have to create a model that focuses on people and what they need as individuals.
And I think that comes with greater self awareness generally with organisations. Sort of more and more places are hearing this term neurodiverse, getting awareness training about it, but then realising that the things that would work for an individual would probably work quite well for the workforce as a whole. And so kind of, you know, being able to dial back the things that have been normalized in terms of stress, in terms of open plan offices, in terms of inflexible working sort of environments, dialing that back will probably help quite a few people. And that's where coaching is really good in terms of allowing individuals to understand much more about what they need to support themselves as well. Brilliant. That takes us nicely onto kind of what at Genius Within we can offer in terms of support, in terms of the awareness training, supporting individuals We do co-coaching with managers and individuals to support the working relationship. It's not mediation, it's just looking at what's working well, what isn't working well, and what needs to happen going forward. And being able to just really allow people to reach their full potential and not be defined by just their condition, but by their capacity. Thank you so much, Siena, for sharing your story. We're here now to answer any questions that people may have. We've got about 15 minutes or so before we have to wrap up. So any questions that people have, any comments, any light bulb moments that people may have had, please do share them with us.
Emma, there's a comment in the chat here about whether companies should have or should be required to have a sort of tailored adjustment form, a standard adjustment form.
I think it's difficult when people don't have an awareness about what they need. So, you know, if people do know what they need to have support, so quite often you'll get people who say, well, what do you need? And they'll go, well, I don't know what's available. Whereas if you have, when I've worked with companies that have more of a menu style of having things available, like assistive software, like read and write, like having Dragon available for everybody that needs to use it, then that's more likely to be taken up by individuals, and having, like I say, managers having more awareness of things to look out for in individuals, not diagnosing them clearly, but kind of saying, I'm noticing you might be having some issues around organizing your time or getting through a written document. Is there anything we can do to support that? So I think rather than putting the onus solely on the individual, I think that it might be useful for organisations to start thinking about how they can support everybody overall. Someone's just made a comment about access to work. Access to work is a fund, a government fund, whereby anyone who has a disability or condition can apply for support within the workplace. Usually it's a 90-minute assessment with the individual and also their line manager. It can also be applied to people who are self-employed. And on that conversation, there will be a number of recommendations made. And so usually that will be a 3-part process in terms of hardware, if someone needs different equipment, physical equipment, assistive software, and the training that will go with that, and also coaching, which will be a one-to-one process. So that is available for individuals, and it can be accessed a number of times. So every time you move a role or every time you move a job, you can apply to the Access to Work fund.
There was another question here about how you can tell whether someone's masking.
It depends, I think, on the length of time that conversation might go for. You might notice that towards the end of the conversation, they're getting a bit twitchy or a bit of impatient. I know that I tend to get quite short when my social energy is kind of tapping out, as I kind of sense it kind of tapping out, and I have to work really hard not to be stroppy. So I don't think you can necessarily tell. It's usually the aftermath of masking that is the problem for the individual. So, you know, that might mean that they're extremely exhausted, withdrawn, just not communicating the way that they want to. Children tend to mask quite well in school, and then you'll see lots of behavioural stuff as soon as they get home. That's usually quite a good indication that someone's been masking, is when they kind of just have outbursts, kind of quite unexpectedly.
Yeah, I would also add to that sometimes when you mask for so long, it does become like a second nature. Like when I'm at home, I still have facial expressions and I still make intonations in my voice, even though that never came naturally, and that was a result of masking. It's just when you get so used to it, sometimes it's not even like a turn off, turn on thing. It just becomes your everyday state of being. But then there are certain things that can be really difficult that you do have to turn off and turn on. And then when that happens, there's definitely a lot of burnout at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's about balancing that social energy that you're expending, and knowing that, you know, if you do have to mask successfully, that you make sure that you've got enough desaturation time either side of an event that you can kind of present if you need to, in terms of kind of, you know, how successful you need to communicate.
we've got quite a few questions that come into the Q&A. So one of the questions, there's a couple around self-diagnosis, but we'll come on to that. There's someone said about how you can support somebody who's at university, who's not had any work experience and is starting on their sort of path for internships and jobs.
It's quite difficult, I think, because quite often we're not given a skill set to move into the workplace. And quite often neurotypicals tend to pick up that stuff, whereas atypicals won't. We have to work a lot harder to understand the unspoken ground rules, the kind of the way that people interact. So, you know, I think that it all comes down to a big picture kind of view, doesn't it? Sort of people are kind of aware that, say, for instance, there may be kind of skills that need to be put into the workplace, then why not start that at university? If universities are better at picking up, and student services are kind of aware that someone may be presenting traits of autism, then surely they could create a program to support those individuals to give them that kind of additional kind of skill set moving forward. I suppose it's really just about kind of, if people can see that it's worthwhile investment in an individual and in a group of individuals so that they're not having to kind of fight fires later on down the track, then it becomes an easier conversation than oh, this is a chore, this is something extra that we have to kind of put in to the system.
Thanks, Emma. There's been a few questions actually around self-diagnosis. Sort of one of them I can see has been answered, but it's around the difference between self-diagnosis and sort of a formal diagnosis. Is a formal diagnosis important? And for those that do self-diagnose, how can they sort of communicate that with their work and their colleagues?
So I suppose one of the conversations, I'll give an example. One of the conversations I had with a client earlier this week was that she's diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia, but she's not diagnosed for 3 other conditions. And she doesn't feel that she wants to go for a formal diagnosis for those conditions because she's already got what she sees as a gateway diagnosis to get support within work. Some organisations require you to have a formal diagnosis in order to access support, but access to work itself doesn't require you to have a formal diagnosis. An assessor can say that you're exhibiting traits of a condition so that you can still be supported. You know, if you feel that you want to go for a formal diagnosis, then your GP is the first place to start. I suppose, you know, if you don't feel as though you need to access additional support, if you feel that you've got enough strategies in place, then just having an awareness of how to support yourself is as much as you probably need. That's kind of where I'm at the moment. But it's what you do with that self-awareness rather than just saying, I am X, Y, and Z. You know, what can you do to support yourself so that you function better within your work sphere and your social sphere?
We've got time for a couple more questions actually, is around the level of support we can provide, and some of them is sort of, can we provide support to those that have just been diagnosed, and also can we support those that are not already in work?
Do you want to say more about that, Laura?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So in terms of supporting those that are not at work, we do deliver this through employability programs. The best sort of place to start really is to talk to your local job centre and inquire about those sorts of programs, and they'll be able to sort of point you in the direction. Depending on where you are, there's a number of different programs, but that's your first port of call really. But yes, Genius Within does work on those sorts of programs as well. So someone's said that due to masking, they've kind of gravitated towards a role that wouldn't have been what they would have chosen. So looking at job crafting as an approach to perhaps find, you know, a better fit, and how would they approach that?
I suppose it's a question of kind of going back to basics about what's important to them in terms of work, the things that they like doing. You know, it's the same as addressing any shift in career. What are the skill sets that you have that you feel that you can bring to a different sphere? coaching can definitely help you discover that, having someone hold that space and hold that picture for you to be able to kind of have a conversation about what's next. That can be really interesting when you're starting to look at it from a neurodiverse perspective, especially if you're starting to look at your strengths that your neurodiversity brings you, to start shaping where you go to next. I suppose it's just about kind of where your interests lie and the skill set that you accrue over your lifetime. Where can you place that? I mean, my previous, well, current but on hold life is as a set and costume designer in theatre and opera. I've also been a scuba diving instructor and run a charity. So, you know, there's a whole mishmash of stuff that I bring into the coaching sphere, but I wouldn't have said necessarily that it was a kind of a direct route to what I'm now doing. But everything that I've done has informed where I've got to.
One thing I would add with just the job sphere is definitely for me, I've really taken advantage of COVID and everything being online. Right now I have a job as a tutor, which I never would have been able to do before, because going into people's homes and not knowing what the sensory environment is like, that would cause me a lot of anxiety. But being able to do things virtually, I found is more autism friendly. And so if you are not happy at the job you're at now, maybe try to find something that you would like more that's in online work.
Thank you very much. There's a question here I just want to put to Siena, actually. We've had a very timely question. Do you offer mentoring programs for young autistic adults to help sort of mentor other autistic teens and young adults? So Siena, I think this is a very timely question for you.
So I got funding from the Paul Hamlin Foundation to do a mentoring project. And so right now, actually I have to get up this full soon to go and interview mentors. The program will be for school-age children though. It won't be for, our mentors will be adults, but the people that'll be mentoring, the mentees, will be school-aged. Yeah, I mean, we are thinking of maybe expanding the project at some point, but definitely I am working also with the NDSA, and they do have mentoring for autistic adults, so that might be a resource to look into as well.
I have to say, within reasonable adjustments and kind of assessments and recommendations that are coming through, the role of the mentor, workplace mentor, is really starting to come through, and it's really important, sort of particularly for having a safe space where someone can vent and kind of talk through things and try and figure out and understand what might have happened on a day-to-day level, is really valuable as a strategy in its own right. So that's something that I always advise people to have within the workplace as a workplace mentor. It might be someone they trust, might not be in their department, but just somewhere that they can talk and try and process something without any consequence of something that may be said that may be perceived as kind of unacceptable within the workplace. So kind of, and also it just allows someone to feel as though they're being heard and seen in a way that is supportive and kind of not non-judgmental. It's a really valuable sort of asset, I think, to have.
Siena, there's a few follow-up questions just on the programme around sort of the geographical area it will cover and whether the school-age children covers up to sixth form, what sort of period it stops.
Yeah, so the geographical area is all going to be online, so it's just within the UK. You can be anywhere in the UK because it will be a virtual mentoring. And then the group of children that we're planning on being the mentees, we want to cover that transition into secondary school because that can be a very difficult time. And so looking at 11 to 12-year-olds, but we might have a few who are a bit older.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more question. So we've got a question here around, it's actually gone back to slightly to the job carving and whether we offer coaching around that subject. So obviously we can offer coaching through Access to Work, but it's just whether we can cover sort of job carving and support on that through our coaching.
I think that tends to come up with quite a few of the clients, actually. Sort of typically more and more people are getting sort of access to work support because they know they need the support within a new role. But quite often people come to coaching because something's not working well, and they haven't got the support and they haven't got strategy in place. So therefore it becomes a bit of a performance issue. So quite often people come to coaching feeling as though they're at a bit of a crossroads anyway. And I think coaching is really useful to be able to help a person understand what they do need to be working at their best, but also what sort of space they need to be in, and what sort of things they want to be doing that actually make them happy and actually make them successful. So the coaching that we do tends to kind of be quite holistic in that aspect, is that we allow an individual to really discover what it is that they need to be happy and successful, and the percentage or kind of like the proportion of our clients that then either move on to things that best suit them or then get promoted because they've got the strategies in place is incredibly high. And there's one comment from one of my clients that's always stayed with me, where he'd been with the same organization for 10 years, and then moved on to something else. And because of the work that we'd done, his comment was, when I moved to the new organization, they weren't just looking for someone to fill that position, they were looking for me. And it was because of what he discovered about himself and where he needed to then look for a new role that allowed him to be able to feel that and kind of be in that space. So it was really that's where that kind of can really kind of be beneficial for people to have that, you know, for us to be part of that journey, for them to kind of find where they need to be at.
Well, thank you very much for all the questions. I think we're sort of coming to the end now. I'll just sort of hand over to Emma and Sienna to sort of wrap up. But just to say, the session will be available on YouTube and we will send the link out. And obviously, I'm sorry if we haven't got to your questions. We will review them all and try to answer those. But do feel free to email us on info@geniuswithin.co.uk if you have any other questions following the session. But I'll just hand over to Emma and Sienna.
Sienna, do you want to wrap up first?
Yeah, of course. I've been really happy to be here and to hear your questions. It's been a very insightful session, and I've been very happy to be able to just share my commentary and my experience of my neurodiversities.
Great. And likewise, you know, we've got lots of resources on the website. You know, if you want to have conversations with any of the coaches about things, or kind of talk to our client services team about kind of support that we offer, then we're very open. We're a very open door. The more awareness that we can get out there, the more support that we can get out there for individuals, the better. Yes, it's just about not letting whatever is present kind of define you in this moment. It's about kind of finding the ultimate destination, and kind of it's all part of one long journey, isn't it, to kind of being as successful as we can be. Thank you very much indeed for being here. Hopefully it's provided some insight and some enlightenment to kind of what might be going on for you. And yeah, hopefully we can share some space again in the future. Thank you.